The unexpected attack. The peaceful planet of Silara was bathed in the soft, golden glow of its twin suns as Lyra, an alien mother, stood by the window. She looked out at the beautiful landscape of forests and rivers that stretched as far as the eye could see. Her daughter, Tala, was playing outside with a small pet. Everything seemed perfect. The day was like any other, calm and serene. But that calm was about to be shattered. Suddenly, a loud noise tore through the sky. It sounded like thunder, but much louder. Lyra's heart skipped a beat. She turned quickly, her eyes searching the horizon. In the distance, a dark cloud was rising. But it wasn't a storm. The sky was filled with the shapes of massive ships, their hulls reflecting the light of the suns. These were no ordinary ships. They were warships, and they were coming closer. They were enemies. Lyra's pulse quickened as the fear surged through her. She knew the legends. There were stories of these invaders, ruthless and merciless. The Zinthari had come, and their goal was to destroy everything in their path. No one was safe. Tala. Lyra shouted, her voice filled with panic. She ran outside, her heart pounding in her chest. Her daughter was still playing, unaware of the danger. Tala. Come inside, quickly. Tala's bright eyes looked up at her mother, puzzled. Why, Mama? What's wrong? Before Lyra could answer, a loud explosion shook the ground beneath them. The sky darkened as the invader ships unleashed their weapons. The city was under attack. Move, Tala. Now. Lyra grabbed her daughter's hand and pulled her inside. She slammed the door shut behind them, her mind racing. Her home, her entire world, was under attack. She had to get them to safety. Where's Father? Tala asked, her voice trembling. Lyra's heart sank. Her husband had been away on a diplomatic mission. He wasn't here to protect them. It was just her and Tala, and the weight of that responsibility felt unbearable. We have to leave. Now, Lyra said, her voice shaking with urgency. Tala looked up at her, fear in her eyes. She didn't fully understand the danger, but she trusted her mother completely. Lyra didn't waste another second. She led Tala through the narrow hallways of their home, moving as fast as she could. Outside, the air was thick with smoke. Explosions echoed around them as buildings collapsed under the relentless attack. The peaceful city that had once been a symbol of their civilization was now a war zone. Lyra kept her head down and ran toward the forest. It was their only chance. If they could get deep enough into the trees, they might be able to hide. But as they ran, the ground shook again. Lyra stumbled, barely catching herself. A Zinthari warship appeared overhead, its massive shape casting a shadow that covered them. The ship hovered silently, its weapons aimed at the ground below. Lyra knew they couldn't outrun it. They were trapped. Tala, hold on to me, Lyra said, pulling her daughter close. But just as the ship was about to fire, something incredible happened. There was a sudden flash of light, and then a loud roar as a different ship appeared from nowhere. It was smaller, faster, and it shot toward the Zinthari ship with incredible speed. The Zinthari ship fired, but the smaller ship dodged the blasts with ease. Lyra watched in awe as the human-made ship soared through the air, launching precision shots at the invaders. It wasn't a perfect battle. There was chaos everywhere. But the human ship had one advantage. It was able to hit back. The Zinthari ship tried to retaliate, but it was no match for the human vessel's speed and firepower. A powerful explosion lit up the sky as the invader ship was struck, its hull cracking open. Lyra blinked in disbelief. Who were these humans? And why were they here? The human ship circled overhead, drawing the attention of the remaining Zinthari forces. It moved in and out of their fire range with ease, each shot more accurate than the last. The battle didn't last long. Soon, the sky was quiet again. Lyra stood frozen, her mind struggling to process what had just happened. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw something moving toward them. A figure in a spacesuit, holding a weapon, approached slowly. It was a man, a human soldier. "Are you two okay?" His voice was calm but urgent, as if he had seen this kind of chaos before. He didn't wait for an answer, just gestured for them to follow him. "Come on, we need to get out of here." Lyra hesitated. This human, this soldier had saved their lives, but he was a stranger. Could she trust him? And what would he want in return for his help? Her heart raced as she weighed her options. Tala, her daughter, pulled at her arm. "Mama, he helped us. We should go with him." Lyra looked at the soldier again, his face hidden behind the helmet. But his eyes, even through the visor, seemed kind. He wasn't here to harm them. With a deep breath, Lyra nodded. They had no choice. They would have to trust him. "Lead the way," Lyra said, her voice firm. There was no time to waste. They had to leave now. The soldier turned and led them toward his ship, his back straight, his pace steady. As they followed, Lyra couldn't help but wonder, who was this human, and what would become of them now? The world around her was falling apart, but perhaps, just perhaps, this human soldier was the one thing that could save them. A soldier's promise. The air inside the ship was thick with silence. The only sound was the soft hum of the engines as the vessel cut through space, leaving the burning planet of Silara behind. Lyra stood near the window, her eyes fixed on the stars, but her mind was far from calm. Her heart still raced from the chaos they had just escaped. The images of burning cities, the sounds of explosions, and the sight of her home being destroyed played over and over in her mind. Beside her, Tala sat quietly, clutching the small blanket to her chest. Her young face was pale, and her eyes were wide with fear, but she didn't cry. She hadn't cried since the attack. Lyra admired her daughter's strength, but it only made her worry more. What had they been through? What would become of them now? Lyra turned away from the window and looked at the soldier who had saved them. He was sitting at the controls, his hand steady as he piloted the ship through the vastness of space. He hadn't said much since they boarded, and Lyra couldn't help but wonder what kind of man he was. He was human, and she had heard stories of their kind, stories filled with both awe and fear. But this soldier, he was different. "Who are you?" Lyra finally asked, her voice soft but sharp. She had to know. He had saved their lives, yes, but there had to be more to his story. "Why did you help us?" The soldier, who had introduced himself as Surgeon Jake, turned his head slightly. His eyes were hidden behind the visor of his helmet, but Lyra could still sense the weight of his gaze. He paused for a moment before answering. "I was following orders," he said quietly. "My unit received a distress signal from your planet. We were sent to help." His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. It was clear he had seen his share of battles, of loss. Lyra narrowed her eyes, trying to understand. "Orders." She shook her head. "Your people. You're here because of orders. What kind of person would risk his life for strangers? For people he's never met, just because of orders?" Jake sighed, and for the first time, he removed his helmet, revealing a weathered face with dark eyes that seemed to carry the weight of years spent in war. He wasn't young, but he wasn't old either. He looked tired, physically, emotionally, as if he had seen too much. He ran a hand through his short, messy hair. "I wasn't just following orders," Jake replied, his voice a little softer. "I'm here because I believe it's the right thing to do. My job is to protect people. Doesn't matter where they come from." He glanced over at Lyra, his gaze steady. "Your planet was attacked. You were in danger. I couldn't just leave you behind." Lyra's thoughts swirled. This man, this soldier, wasn't just a stranger who happened to save them. He was a protector. But still, he was human, and Lyra had no idea what to make of that. Her people had always viewed humans from a distance. There had been brief exchanges, but nothing more. Was this soldier truly what he seemed, or was he hiding something? Before she could ask more questions, Tala's small voice broke through the tension. "Will you take us to safety?" she asked, looking up at Jake with wide eyes. Will we be safe there? Jake turned to face her, and for a moment, Lyra saw something she hadn't expected. A softness in his eyes, an expression of care that seemed almost out of place for someone like him. He gave her a small, reassuring smile. "You'll be safe," he said. "I promise." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. A promise. It was a word she hadn't heard in a long time, and she wasn't sure if she could believe it. She wasn't sure if she could trust this man, this human soldier, but there was something in his voice, in the way he said it, that made her want to believe him. Tala smiled back, relieved. "Thank you." Lyra watched her daughter, and something inside her softened. Tala needed someone to believe in, and perhaps this soldier, this human, could be the one to help them rebuild their lives. But Lyra couldn't ignore the voice in her head, the voice that warned her not to trust too easily. Jake noticed her hesitation, and nodded as if understanding her thoughts. "I know you have questions," he said, turning back to the controls. "But for now, you're safe. We'll get you somewhere safe. Then you can ask all the questions you want." Lyra didn't answer right away. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about this man. The way he spoke, the way he looked at her and Tala. It was as if he wasn't just trying to do his job. It was as if he cared, in a way she couldn't explain. But trust didn't come easily to someone who had lost everything. The ship hummed steadily as they traveled farther into the unknown reaches of space. Outside the window, the stars flickered like tiny diamonds scattered across a dark velvet sky. It was peaceful, but Lyra knew the peace was only temporary. They were safe, for now. But the future was uncertain, and the questions that burned in her mind would have to wait. For the moment, all she could do was keep her promise to Tala, to protect her, to keep her safe, whatever that took. And maybe, just maybe, this human soldier was the one who could help them. The journey through darkness. The stars outside the ship's windows glittered, distant and cold, as if mocking the uncertainty that gnawed at Lyra's insides. They had been traveling for hours, away from the burning remnants of her home. But the deeper they flew into the vast emptiness of space, the more uncertain she felt. It wasn't just the fear of what lay ahead, but the unease of being completely alone, her world reduced to a tiny fragment in the cold, dark expanse. Tala had fallen asleep beside her, her head resting on her mother's lap. Lyra gently stroked her daughter's hair, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She had promised Tala safety, but the universe was vast, and there were dangers beyond her understanding. What if this human soldier wasn't who he seemed to be? What if they were just pawns in some larger game? She shook off the thought, trying to focus on the present. They had to survive. They had to find a place where they could rebuild. Jake, the human soldier who had rescued them, was busy at the ship's controls. His back was turned, but Lyra could feel his presence like a constant shadow. He had been quiet for most of the journey, but there was something in his silence that made her feel uneasy, as if he was watching them without saying a word. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Jake spoke without turning around. "We're approaching a dense sector of space. There's a good chance we'll run into some obstacles. Stay alert." Lyra tensed, her instincts kicking in. She wasn't a fighter, but she knew how to survive. "What kind of obstacles?" she asked, her voice steady despite the tension in her chest. "Pirates, rogue factions, that sort of thing," Jake replied, his tone casual, but his eyes scanning the vast space ahead. He didn't sound worried, but Lyra could hear the undertone of caution in his words. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a survivor. As they ventured deeper into the unknown, the stars began to fade, replaced by an eerie fog that seemed to swallow the ship whole. It was unlike anything Lyra had ever seen. Dark, swirling clouds that pulsed with a strange energy, as if they were alive. She leaned forward, pressing her face against the cool glass of the window, her breath fogging up the surface. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's a nebula," Jake said, glancing briefly at her before returning his gaze to the controls. "It's unstable. We'll need to fly through it carefully." Tala stirred in her sleep, sensing the change in the air. She slowly opened her eyes and looked up at Lyra, her face a mix of fear and curiosity. "Are we safe?" Lyra smiled gently and nodded, but the uncertainty in her own heart made her words feel hollow. "We're safe, Tala. We just have to be careful." But as the ship drifted closer to the nebula, the calm outside gave way to a storm of chaos inside the vessel. The ship's engines began to sputter, and the lights flickered. Jake cursed under his breath, his fingers flying across the console. "Hold on," he shouted as the ship suddenly jolted violently, throwing Lyra and Tala off balance. Tala yelped in surprise, gripping her mother's arm as they both struggled to keep steady. "What's happening?" Lyra demanded, panic rising in her chest. "We're being pulled into the nebula's gravity well," Jake said, his voice tense. "I'm trying to get us out, but the systems are failing." The ship lurched again, this time throwing them against the walls. Lyra's heart pounded in her chest, and she held on to Tala as tightly as she could. There was no telling how dangerous this was. The nebula was known for tearing apart ships that weren't properly equipped to navigate it, and they were barely getting by with the limited technology they had. Suddenly, the ship's warning alarms began to blare, their shrill sound cutting through the chaos. "Shields at 30%, a voice shouted through the comms. "Hull integrity compromised." Jake cursed again, his face set with determination. "We're not going to make it through this without some damage. Stay low and brace yourselves." Lyra had no choice but to obey. She crouched down with Tala, wrapping her arms around her as the ship was pulled deeper into the nebula. The ship's engines roared and groaned, as if they were being torn apart from the inside. The air grew thick and heavy, and the temperature fluctuated wildly, making it hard to breathe. For a moment, everything seemed to blur together, lights flashing, alarms blaring, and the ship shaking violently. Lyra could feel her body growing numb from the stress, her head spinning as the world around her felt like it was collapsing. Then, as quickly as it had started, the chaos stopped. The ship came to a sudden, jarring halt. There was silence. Lyra slowly opened her eyes, her breath coming in quick, shallow gasps. She looked around, her mind struggling to catch up. Tala was still clinging to her, her eyes wide with fear but unhurt. They were still alive. For now. Jake let out a slow breath, his hand steady on the controls. The ship had stopped in the heart of the nebula, surrounded by a deadly calm. He didn't speak for a moment, just focused on the sensors in front of him. "We're not out of the woods yet," he finally said, his voice low. "But we've got a brief window to make repairs. We need to get the engines back online before we're stuck here forever." Lyra's heart sank. The danger wasn't over. They had survived the first hurdle, but there were more to come. She looked at Jake, realizing just how much they depended on him. He had kept them alive so far, but could he get them out of this alive too? As she glanced out the window, the swirling darkness of the nebula seemed to mock her, an endless void that threatened to swallow them whole. But Lyra knew one thing for sure: they had no choice but to keep moving forward. Tala's request. The hours stretched into what felt like days as the ship drifted through the silent darkness of space, trapped in the heart of the nebula. The flickering lights and the low hum of the damaged engines were constant reminders of how close they had come to being lost forever. The ship's interior was claustrophobic, filled with the smell of metal and the faint scent of burned circuits from the near meltdown. Lyra sat on a small bench, her thoughts a whirl of conflicting emotions. Her home had been destroyed, her people scattered, and now she was alone with Tala in the company of a human soldier she barely knew. Her protective instincts flared at the thought of all the uncertainty ahead, but she also found herself oddly grateful to Jake. Without him, they wouldn't have survived. She had to admit it, but that didn't mean she could completely trust him. Not yet. Tala, meanwhile, had been uncharacteristically quiet. She had withdrawn into herself, spending most of her time near the window, staring out into the swirling clouds of the nebula, her little face full of wonder and confusion. Lyra watched her daughter carefully. Tala had been through so much, and yet she was still trying to make sense of their new reality. Finally, as Lyra sat lost in thought, Tala's small voice broke the silence. "Mama," Tala began, her voice soft but clear. "I want to ask something." Lyra turned to her daughter, her heart tightening. "What is it, Tala?" Tala didn't meet her gaze at first. She looked down at her hands, fiddling with the edge of her blanket. When she finally spoke, her voice was hesitant, almost as if she was afraid of the answer. "Why did you say that we'd be safe with him?" Tala asked, looking up at Lyra with wide, innocent eyes. "Do you think he could be my father?" The question hit Lyra like a cold wave. For a moment, she was speechless, her throat tightening. She hadn't expected Tala to ask something so profound, so raw. She wasn't sure how to answer, how to explain that their world had been turned upside down, and that she didn't even know who she could trust anymore. Least of all Jake, the human soldier who had appeared out of nowhere. But Tala's gaze was unwavering. She wasn't looking for an explanation. She was searching for something more, something Lyra couldn't quite put into words. Tala's eyes were filled with that quiet, unspoken need for security, for the promise of safety in a world that had shattered around them. Lyra swallowed hard, her heart aching. "Tala, you know I love you more than anything in this universe," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I would never let anyone hurt you." "I know, Mama," Tala whispered, nodding. "But I think I need him to be my father. I need him to protect us." Lyra's chest tightened. Tala's innocence was both a blessing and a curse in a world so dangerous. She had seen the way Jake had acted around them, protective, calm, as if he knew what he was doing. There was a part of Lyra that wanted to believe that Jake could be the father figure Tala was yearning for. But was that really possible? Was it safe? Before Lyra could respond, she heard Jake's voice from the doorway. He had been in the cockpit, making repairs to the ship's systems, but now he stood at the entrance to the small living area, his expression unreadable. "Tala, Lyra, we're almost through the worst of it," Jake said, his voice gruff. "We've got a few more hours before we reach a safer zone. You should both get some rest while you can." Tala looked up at Jake, her eyes still wide with uncertainty, but now there was something else in them, a glimmer of hope. She stood up slowly, walking toward him. "Jake," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, Can you be my father?" The words hung in the air, thick with meaning. Lyra's heart froze. She had never expected her daughter to ask something like that, especially not to a human. But there was no mistaking it. Tala was serious. Jake blinked, clearly caught off guard. He glanced at Lyra, but she didn't know what to say. Her heart pounded as she tried to process the gravity of the moment. This wasn't just a request for safety. This was a plea for something deeper, something more personal. Tala wasn't just asking for protection. She was asking for a family, a father. And Jake, the man who had rescued them, was now being asked to take on that role. For a long moment, Jake didn't speak. He simply stood there, his face softening. His mind seemed to be working through the question, through the impossibility of it all. Finally, he bent down to Tala's level, his expression thoughtful. "I don't know if I can be your father, Tala," Jake said quietly. "I don't know if I can ever fill that role. But I can promise you this. I'll do everything I can to keep you safe, and I'll protect both of you, no matter what happens." Tala nodded, her face brightening with a sense of relief. She smiled, though it was still laced with uncertainty. She wasn't asking for the impossible, not really. She just wanted to believe in something again. She just wanted to feel safe. Lyra stood in the background, her emotions swirling. Jake had given her an answer that wasn't a promise of fatherhood, but it was a promise of protection. It wasn't much, but it was enough for now. And for Tala, it was everything. "Thank you," Tala whispered, her voice filled with gratitude. Jake straightened up, nodding. "Don't mention it. We're in this together." Lyra watched the exchange, her mind still struggling to accept everything. She had come to terms with the idea that they were at the mercy of this human soldier. But seeing Tala's hopeful face, hearing Jake's words, it made something inside her shift. Perhaps for now, that was enough. As the ship glided forward through the darkness, Lyra's thoughts lingered on her daughter's request. Could Jake ever truly be the father Tala needed? Could Lyra ever allow that bond to form between them? The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They were all in this together now, and together, they would survive whatever came next. Facing the past. The silence of space had its own kind of weight, one that pressed down on the ship's small crew. After days of turbulence, near misses, and survival, they had finally broken free of the nebula's grasp. But that didn't mean they were free from the quiet tension that had settled in between them. The ship moved steadily through space, the stars outside now calm, distant, and unmoving. The journey was far from over, but for the first time, there was a sense of stillness that was almost unnerving. Lyra sat in the small galley, her eyes absent-mindedly tracing the contours of a star chart on the table. Her mind was elsewhere, though, far from the peaceful sky above. She had spent the last few days with her thoughts spinning in a constant loop. How had everything gone so wrong? What happened to her people, her home, the life she had known? And why had she allowed herself to trust Jake? Her gaze shifted to Tala, who was sitting by the window, staring out into the vast expanse. Her daughter hadn't said much since her request to Jake. She seemed to be in her own world, lost in her thoughts. It was a strange kind of quiet, one that filled Lyra with both concern and a strange comfort. Tala had been through so much, and yet here she was, resilient, still hopeful. Lyra took a deep breath. They needed to talk. She needed to understand this human soldier better. She needed to know why he had made the choices he had, why he was even here. She couldn't keep ignoring the questions that burned inside her. She stood and walked over to the small cockpit, where Jake was monitoring the ship's systems. The low hum of the engines filled the space, but Jake's focus was absolute. His eyes were sharp, scanning the data as if every number and reading meant something important. He hadn't been much for conversation lately, and Lyra had noticed his quiet, brooding moments where the weight of something unseen seemed to pull at him. "Jake," Lyra said softly, breaking the silence. He looked up, his expression unreadable, though his eyes softened just a little when he saw her standing there. "You need something?" he asked, his voice calm. But there was an undercurrent to it, something that hinted at deeper things. Lyra hesitated. Her mind raced for the right words. She didn't want to pry into his past, not if he wasn't ready to share. But she couldn't ignore the feeling that there was more to him than the soldier who had appeared out of nowhere to save them. She needed to understand. "Why did you come for us?" she asked, her voice steady but probing. "I don't mean to sound ungrateful, but why risk your life for us? For me and my daughter? You didn't even know us. You don't even know our people. So why?" Jake paused, and for the first time, there was a flicker of something in his eyes. Something darker, something that revealed a glimpse of pain. He didn't speak right away, but his fingers slowly traced the edge of the console, as if the answer was somehow written in the data swirling before him. "I didn't know you," Jake said at last, his voice low and distant. "I didn't know anything about you, but I've been where you are. I've lost everything, too. I've had my whole world torn apart. I couldn't just stand by and watch it happen to someone else." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. There was something in his words that struck a chord with her, something that made her realize just how much she had underestimated him. For all the strength he had shown in rescuing them, there was a vulnerability in him that no amount of armor or weapons could hide. Jake looked up at her, and this time, his gaze was more intense, more open. "When I was younger, I lost my family. A raid, a sudden attack, just like what happened to you. I was too late to save them. I couldn't protect them. Ever since then, I made it my job to protect others, even strangers." The words hung in the air like a weight Lyra hadn't expected. He had lost his family, She had assumed he was just a soldier, doing his duty. But to hear him speak of loss, of grief, changed everything. It humanized him in a way that Lyra hadn't considered. She glanced at the small communicator screen on the wall of the cockpit, a soft flicker of light catching her eye. She was about to speak when Tala's voice came through the comms, interrupting the moment. "Mama," Tala said, her voice small but clear. "Jake, he helped me earlier. I think he's really trying to protect us." Lyra turned toward the communicator and blinked in surprise. Tala had spoken so simply, so matter-of-factly, as if the trust she had placed in Jake was something she had already decided. Lyra felt a rush of emotions, pride in her daughter's unwavering faith, but also a deep, sinking realization. Tala was looking to Jake as more than just a protector. She was looking to him as a father. Lyra exhaled slowly, her mind returning to the conversation she had been having with Jake. "You never really said why you do this," she said after a long pause. "Why fight? Why risk it all?" Jake gave a dry, almost sad chuckle. "It's not about fighting. Not for me. It's about making sure that people like you don't have to lose everything the way I did. I don't want anyone to go through that kind of pain." His voice cracked slightly, betraying the depth of emotion behind his words. Lyra saw something in him, something fragile, something broken, and she couldn't ignore it anymore. He wasn't just a soldier. He was a man who had been scared by loss, much like her. They both had their pasts, their wounds, and in some strange way their pain had drawn them together. As Lyra stood there, she realized the significance of what Jake had said. He had not only saved their lives, but he had also offered them a chance, an opportunity to build something new, something strong, a chance to heal. She could still feel the weight of her own losses, but she also felt something else, a spark of hope, however small. Together, they could rebuild. Together, they could create a future. And maybe, just maybe, she could allow herself to trust Jake a little more. Perhaps he wasn't just the soldier who saved them. Perhaps he was something more. But that was a journey they would have to take one step at a time. A new beginning. The stars were no longer distant specks in the cold vacuum of space. They had become guides, beacons of something unknown but hopeful. After days of uncertainty, hours of silence, and nights filled with uneasy dreams, the ship was finally on course toward something resembling safety. The wreckage of their old lives had begun to fade into the background, replaced by the sharp, constant hum of the ship's engines and the faint sound of their collective breaths. Lyra stared out the window, her gaze fixed on the stars as they passed in streaks of light. The galaxy seemed infinite, an endless sea of possibilities, but in her heart there was no escaping the nagging feeling of fear. Every journey had its risks, and this one, no matter how much they had survived, was far from over. Beside her, Tala was quietly drawing on a piece of scrap paper, her small fingers working swiftly, capturing the world as she saw it. She hadn't spoken much in the last few hours, but Lyra could see that her daughter was beginning to process what had happened, slowly starting to make sense of the pieces. The question wasn't about the destruction of their home anymore. It was about moving forward. And as much as Lyra hated to admit it, she wasn't sure how to lead them forward. Her purpose had always been tied to Xilora, to the life they once had. Now she wasn't sure where to find the strength to keep moving. But Jake, the soldier, seemed unaffected, calm, steady. And for that, Lyra couldn't help but admire him, even if she still couldn't quite bring herself to trust him fully. "How much longer?" Lyra asked, her voice quiet but pressing. Jake, who had been working at the ship's control panel, glanced at her, then back to the star map in front of him. His face remained unreadable, but there was a sense of determination in his posture. "Another few hours," he said. "We'll be reaching the safety zone soon. There's a planet up ahead, a neutral zone. It's not much, but it's enough for now." Lyra nodded, though she felt her pulse quicken at the thought of landing on a new world, uncertain and unfamiliar. There would be no Xilora to return to, no home to rebuild, "Is this it then? We'll start over?" she asked, the weight of the question hanging in the air. Jake didn't answer immediately. He looked at her for a long moment, his gaze softening in a way that made her uncomfortable. He wasn't looking at her as a stranger or an alien anymore. He was looking at her as a person, as someone who had shared the same weight of loss. And in that moment, she realized that maybe, just maybe, he was seeing her as something more. "This planet," Jake said slowly, "it's not home. Not yet. But it could be. If you're willing to build it." Lyra turned to him, surprised by his words. She had expected a simple answer, one filled with promises of safety or escape. But instead, he was giving her something more. Hope. A chance. It was a strange thing, hope. It had felt so far away since the destruction of Silara. But here, in this tiny, fragile ship with a human who had no reason to care for them, it felt just a little bit closer. Tala looked up from her drawings, her eyes bright with curiosity. "Can we make a new home there?" she asked, her voice soft but full of wonder. "Can we make it just like our old one?" Lyra smiled gently at her daughter's question, though the answer was complicated. She didn't know if they could ever recreate what they had lost. But maybe that wasn't the point. Maybe starting over didn't mean recreating the past. Maybe it meant finding something new, something better, something they could build together. "We can make it whatever we want it to be, Tala," Lyra replied, her voice firm despite the uncertainty in her heart. "We'll find a way." Jake's eyes flickered with something close to approval as he turned back to the control panel. "I'll make sure we get there in one piece," he said, his voice steady. "And when we land, we'll figure it out. One step at a time." The words hung in the air, simple but powerful. They were going to make it through this together, no matter what it took. The rest of the journey passed in quiet anticipation, with Lyra staring out at the stars and wondering what awaited them on the other side. There was still so much they didn't know, so much that was out of their control. But for the first time in days, the uncertainty didn't feel as heavy. They were going forward, together. As the hours passed, the dark expanse of space began to lighten, revealing the soft glow in the distance. The planet was coming into view. It was small, just a pale blue and green sphere floating in the emptiness. But it was enough. It was something they could reach. And that was all that mattered. Jake set the ship on course for the planet's surface, the ship's engines humming steadily beneath them. Lyra felt a strange calm wash over her, mixed with the lingering tension of the unknown. But there was no turning back now. The planet was waiting for them, and with it, a chance for a new life. When the ship finally broke through the atmosphere, the sky opened up in a burst of light. A lush, vibrant world greeted them, filled with vast oceans, deep forests, and clear skies. It was beautiful. It was different. It was alive. Lyra took a deep breath, her heart filling with something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Maybe they hadn't lost everything after all. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. And for the first time since Silara had burned, Lyra felt ready to take that first step into the unknown. Together, they would rebuild. Together, they would find their place in this strange, new world. And perhaps, just perhaps, they could finally find home again. A family reborn. The ship descended slowly, the engines humming a steady rhythm as it neared the surface of the unknown planet. The lush greenery below seemed endless, stretching out into vast landscapes of rolling hills, rivers, and towering mountains. It was nothing like the sterile, high-tech cities of Silara, but there was a certain raw beauty in the untamed wilderness that spread beneath them. It felt like a world that was untouched, waiting for someone to make it their own. Lyra sat in the cockpit, her hands resting in her lap. She hadn't realized until this moment how tightly she had been holding on to the past. The memories of Silara, of her people, of the life she had known, still clung to her heart like a weight. The idea of starting over, of rebuilding, was terrifying. But as the planet's surface grew closer, the weight seemed to lessen, just a little. Maybe, just maybe, this could be the beginning of something new. Beside her, Tala pressed her face to the window, eyes wide with wonder as the planet's terrain shifted below them. Her small hand rested against the cool glass, her fingers tracing the shapes of the mountains, the rivers, the forests. For the first time since the attack on their home, Lyra saw a spark of joy in her daughter's eyes. "Mama," Tala whispered, her voice filled with awe. "It's beautiful here." Lyra smiled, her heart swelling at the sight of her daughter's wonder. "Yes, Tala," she whispered back. "It is beautiful." But there was more than beauty here. There was potential. There was hope. The ship touched down gently, the final hum of the engines dying down as the landing gear settled into the soft earth. They were on solid ground. No more running. No more surviving. They had arrived. Jake stood at the doorway, already in motion, unstrapping his seatbelt and heading toward the hatch. His movements were confident, but Lyra could see the weight of the moment in the way his shoulders tensed. He, too, had been through so much, and the journey ahead was unknown for him as much as it was for them. But he had never hesitated to get them this far. Tala hopped to her feet, eager and filled with excitement. "Are we going out now? Can we explore?" Her voice was bright, like the sun rising after a long, dark night. Jake turned to her with a smile, his gaze softening as he reached out to help her with her seatbelt. "Of course. We're free now, kid. Let's go see what this place has to offer." Lyra's heart gave a small lurch at the words, at the simplicity of the promise. Free. She hadn't let herself believe it until now, but they were free. No longer bound to the ashes of Silara, no longer running from danger. They had a future to build. The air outside the ship was fresh, crisp with the scent of earth and green leaves. It felt alive in a way Lyra hadn't experienced in years. The sun here was bright but gentle, casting a golden light over the landscape. Tall trees stood like ancient sentinels, their branches reaching toward the sky. Birds, strange, colorful creatures, flitted through the air, singing songs she had never heard before. The world was so different, and yet it felt right. It felt like the kind of place where new beginnings could grow. Lyra stepped out of the ship, her boots sinking slightly into the soft soil. She looked around, breathing in the fresh air as a feeling she hadn't known in so long washed over her, a sense of peace, a sense of possibility. Jake stepped beside her, his presence calm and steady. He surveyed the area, his military instincts sharp, but there was something else in his gaze, a quiet wonder, as if he was seeing this planet with fresh eyes too. "You think it'll be enough?" Lyra asked, her voice barely more than a whisper. She wasn't sure if she was asking about the planet, about the future, or about the journey they had all just endured. But she needed to ask, needed to hear the answer, even if it wasn't clear. Jake's eyes softened, and for the first time, he didn't look like a soldier, a protector, or a stranger. He just looked like a man who had found his place in a world that needed him. "It will be enough," he said quietly. "We'll make it enough." Tala tugged at Lyra's hand, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Mama, look. There's so much to explore. We can build anything here, right?" Lyra looked down at her daughter, her heart full. This was it. This was the moment when everything changed. She could see it now, not just the planet, not just the promise of safety, but the chance to build something. Together. For so long, Lyra had been carrying the weight of a past she couldn't change. She had been living in the shadows of loss, afraid to let go, afraid to step forward. But now, standing on this new, vibrant world, she realized something that shifted her entire perspective. She didn't have to rebuild the life she had lost. She didn't have to carry the weight of what had been. She could create something new, something stronger, something filled with the love and resilience she had always carried inside her. And with Jake, with Tala, they could build that life. They could create a family again. Tala, ever the optimist, was already racing toward the trees, calling over her shoulder, "Come on, Mama. Let's go see the animals." Lyra's heart warmed as she watched her daughter run, the joy in her every step a reminder of why they had to keep going. She looked at Jake, her eyes steady. "You're right," she said softly. "It will be enough. We'll make it enough." Jake nodded, his expression resolute. Together. Lyra smiled, her heart swelling with something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. They weren't just surviving anymore. They weren't just fleeing from the destruction of their past. They were starting something new. A family. A home. And maybe, just maybe, they could finally leave the past behind.